Welcome to Long History Short, where we discuss the historical context needed to understand today's global politics. I'm your host, Brian Stahl. Boko Haram, the jihadist terrorist group, has been engaged in an insurgency against the Nigerian government since 2009. Boko Haram became notorious across the Western world in 2014 when they kidnapped 276 schoolgirls. Recently, President Trump threatened to cut off foreign aid to Nigeria after he accused the government of failing to protect its Christian population. And President Trump has also threatened to employ U.S. military forces to combat Boko Haram. The situation is evolving day by day, but to understand this conflict, first we need to understand the history of Nigeria. Let's get started. Joining us today is Professor Toja Okoh from Loyola University of Maryland. Professor Okoh earned her PhD in African history from NYU in 2012. Before coming to Loyola, she taught at the University of Akron from 2013 to 2018, and she has also worked as a consultant for the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. Her book, Minority Identities in Nigeria, Claiming and Contesting Citizenship in the 20th Century, just came out through Cambridge University Press, and I am very excited to have her on the show. Welcome, Professor Okoh.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's dive in. Boko Haram is a radical Muslim organization, and many of their targets are other Muslims, particularly Shia Muslims and other Muslims whom they deem either heretical or insufficiently radical. There's also a large Christian population in Nigeria, and one of the reasons Boko Haram is in the news is because of their violence towards Christians. Could you give us some background on Nigeria's religious demographics? Be a little bit much to try to do both at the same time. So let's start with Islam. When and how did Islam come to Nigeria?
Islam originally came during the first wave of Islam entering into West Africa, which was around the maybe 9th, 10th century, maybe a little bit earlier, actually. And as far as to Nigeria specifically, we really see a consolidation of Islam around the 12th and 13th centuries. So it's been there for a long time. And the specific kind of Islam that really took root in that part of the world was Sufism, which is a sort of Shia branch of the religion in terms of heterodoxy. And so part of what is being worked out right now in much of the Islamic world, much less in Nigeria and West Africa, is the Sunni sort of version of Islam being used to reform any other sort of sects of Islam.
Okay. And then how about Christianity? When and how did that spread in Nigeria?
So Christianity came largely in the, I would say, early 19th century with the Christian missionaries, especially during the period of abolition or period shortly thereafter, with missionaries coming from largely the Anglican Church Missionary Society. Most of the missionaries that came were recaptured enslaved folks who had been converted in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia. And since then, we've had quite a lot of evangelization in southern Nigeria, particularly in the coastal areas. This is where it gets introduced and then sort of spread. And we really see an acceleration after the 1870s, 1880s, when Great Britain starts to really kind of take a foothold in an economic interest in the region, is when we also see a sort of surge in presence from both Europe as well as the United States.
Okay, I didn't realize the United States was also involved in the missionary activity.
Yes.
So there's a division between North and South Nigeria, right? And it's partially religious. My understanding is that the North is mostly Muslim and the South is more Christian, but there's also ethnic and economic divisions. Can you talk a little bit about where these divisions come from?
Yeah, so when the British formally took these territories as protectorates in the latter part of the 19th century, so after the scramble happened in 1884, they really took of this territory now called Nigeria uh, in two separate spaces. So we had the Northern Protectorate and the Southern Protectorate, and then we had the colony of Lagos, which was established in 1861, which is pretty early. And they ran each of these protectorates very differently. Administratively, they were separate, with different governors, different commissioners, etc. And they amalgamated these territories in 1914, right at the beginning of World War One. This is also kind of coinciding with the consolidation of colonial power throughout Africa at this time. And so most of the division is largely stemming from administrative division more than anything else. It was more pragmatic for the British to organize things this way as opposed to really organizing things organically on the ground. Um, it also so happened that the northern protectorates had already long established caliphates and sultanates and had been in existence prior to this period. So they just kind of sat on top of the indigenous administrative structures that the Hausa and Fulani had already established in that region. In southern Nigeria, we see a much more heterogeneous picture. You have the division is largely sort of set up geographically by the Niger River and the Benue River. And so you have east and west in the southern part divided, which also has some historical precedents. So the Oyo Empire really defined the western part of Nigeria and where a lot of Christianity initiated. And in the southeastern part of Nigeria, you see Christianity coming in later, largely in the early part of the 20th century. It's less hierarchically organized. These are communities that are largely governed by council as opposed to a king or an alba or a sultan. And so you had a very different political structure, local political structure that plays into how they were governed by the British and then eventually after independence. So a lot of these things have long legacies, long strands of history to them.
Hmm. So in the late 1800s, like you said, in 1884, that's when the scramble for Africa started. So, Britain and France and Germany, and to a lesser extent, other European countries all dove in and started carving up Africa and taking different colonies. But the British, like you mentioned briefly, had already taken an interest in Nigeria.
Mhm.
Why was that? Why did they get there earlier than everybody else?
They were largely interested in palm oil. So the British, of course, were fairly supreme in the Industrial Revolution. And you imagine what vegetable oils were very, very valuable at this time, largely for lubricating machinery. And so if you think of palm oil, we often think of it right now, it's an additive for a lot of foods. But back then, it was largely used for industrial purposes in Europe, as well as for making soap. And so it was very lucrative. It was the number one export from southern Nigeria. And the British were competing with the Germans and the French in places like what is now the Ivory Coast and Togo for palm oil production, as well as the Congo. So that was why they were there. They were originally called the oil protectorates because of this commodity, and so that's how they entered into the space.
Hmm. And what were the lasting effects of British rule? I mean, besides we already talked a little bit about the administrative structuring, but what kind of impact did their rule have, both maybe positive and negative? And
Mhm.
do any of those legacies of British colonialism still impact the political situation in Nigeria today?
Yeah, I mean, I always hesitate to say positive versus negative. I think the way I would sort of describe British legacies is complexity and complication. Um, I would say that the biggest legacy that the British had on Nigeria was its administrative structure and sort of how Nigeria was kind of formed as a unit. they didn't do very much to uh, integrate all three of these regions and actually administered them very separately and differently up until um, the 19 after World War II. And so it's a really recent sort of occurrence for Nigeria to be considered a singular unit, political unit. And I do think that this has a lot to play into the politics of the present. I would say that religion is often used as a simple shorthand for talking about political conflict in Nigeria, whereas the the drivers of conflict are largely around resources and the distribution of resources and redistribution of resources, whether they're political resources or material resources.
We'll definitely get into that later. That's a very interesting take. With respect to unification, though, was it a mistake? Like, was trying to cobble these arguably two or three regions together into one country? Do you think that that was an error? Should they have kind of created maybe three separate countries, or maybe done something else entirely?
That's a very good question that even Nigerians have and have had for a long time, actually. In fact, my book deals with a moment where there was a possibility of having more than three regions and rather more like six regions. And I will say that the answer to that question lies in the fragmentation of Nigeria post independence. So it went from three regions to four regions to 19 regions to now, 36 regions. And so in some ways, it has devolved into a sort of fragmentary federated system, something that early nationalist thinkers were already predicting precisely because of the lack of integration. So in a way, I wouldn't say it was a mistake. I do think it is a product of history. And when thinking about what other options there were at the end of World War II for reconfiguring the politics of Nigeria, it was easier for the British to keep things the way they were because the plan was to continue a relationship in some way with Nigeria economically. Um, and so it was more expedient to do it this way. And they were largely in control of that throughout much of the decolonization period. They often played regional politics, pitted one region up against the other during the 1940s and 1950s, really setting up for a culture of regionalization as opposed to a more federated, sort of horizontal kind of um, system.
So they essentially, to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, they played the different regions off against each other so as to make sure that they were still in control and on top. Okay, very
Mhm,
interesting.
mhm.
So how did Nigeria gain its independence? I mean, we're kind of going quickly between when it was taken over and when it gained its independence, but can
Yeah.
you talk to me a little bit about maybe the ramp up to that too? You know, during World War One, World War Two, where did these or how did these ideas of we want independence and the slow maybe assertion of that against British rule, how did that
Mhm.
ramp up? And then how did it eventually gain its independence?
So things really started escalating after World War II. And in the 1930s, so prior to World War II getting off the ground, there were quite a lot of labor strikes across the British Empire, not just in West Africa, but in the Caribbean, but also the French Empire. This was not just an isolated thing. And it is out of those labor movements and trade unionism and sort of those kinds of sort of labor movements that we begin to see some nationalist sentiment and anti-colonial sentiment emerge during the war. And after the war, Europe was kind of on its hind feet, really trying to recover now from two wars as opposed to just World War One, much less World War Two, and they really couldn't afford to maintain their empires. And so, in many ways, we had very different imaginations in terms of what the world would look like going forward. The British had their ideas, so did the French. They thought they were going to hold on to these territories for another 100 years, and they said as much explicitly in their documents. Um, the nationalists had other ideas, and their initial ideas weren't immediately emancipation, but some kind of confederation with the British Empire as participants, as citizens within the empire, having some kinds of sort of rights for sort of on the national level, but also having some imperial rights, which they hadn't had before. And so you had various ideas like Pan Africanism, you have the Commonwealth, which is something that the British were able to cobble together as a kind of second option for themselves, before even thinking about full on independence. It was clear to the British very quickly that they weren't able to sort of maintain the vastness of their empire. You had also other colonies that were devolving into violence. So where they could, they arranged for a more sort of reformist approach, and this is what Nigeria takes, is a more constitutional reform as the way towards independence. The British expected this process to happen much longer, and of course the Nigerians were trying to speed it up. And so along the way they made concessions to the British in order to get this faster timeline, one of which was you have to stay together. Part of what was being debated until 1957 was whether or not Nigeria needed to be carved up into more separate regions that were more affinitive to the local ethnic identities and identities that Nigeria is made of, which is over 250 of them. Which you can imagine that must have been overwhelming at the time. So what happens is the constitutional reform, and they get to the end of this process, having to compromise that idea, and accept the preset three region structure that the British had already kind of maintained over the past, 2 or 3 decades before that. And so they gained their independence in 1960 with this already kind of established federal structure. And because Nigerians had not had practice being Nigerian prior to this period, you have a very short, sort of steep learning curve in terms of what it means to be a Nigerian and what it means to, share politics, right? The political field. So, yeah, that's kind of a fast and dirty take on the story.
Sure. Now, they discovered oil. I was reading up on this in 1956, correct? That
Yes.
didn't, I'm kind of surprised, honestly, that 4 years after discovering oil, British were amenable to giving up this country. Did that change the calculus at all, or?
Well, they didn't give up their assets. They maintained control over the oil through their multinational sort of conglomerate. So at the time, it was British Petroleum, BP. They had already established the kind of global infrastructure that was necessary to maintain this in Iran, which explains Iran's history. And so, having done that, they already knew how to set up and very quickly establish a new political economy of crude oil. And so, in many ways, the compromise was you run the politics and we'll keep working on the economics, and we still have an economic relationship. And the British maintained a very secure economic position with Nigeria for a very long time. Other players entered the picture. The United States is one big player. Um, Nigeria's oil is some of the sweetest, call it, in the world, meaning that it requires very little refining, and so it's very, very sought after. It was at one point the eighth largest oil producer in the world, and so Great Britain gained quite a lot in the arrangement post independence. So yeah.
It's interesting. You don't hear it talked about in the same vein as maybe Saudi Arabia or Russia, some of the other ones that are kind of famous for oil production, but the eighth largest in the world and the sweetest in the world. That's very interesting. So
Mhm.
you mentioned before how they didn't have a whole lot of practice at being Nigerian, and I think you can maybe see that in some of the political developments that come later, because only a few years after independence, Nigeria was plunged into a very, very bloody civil war with the new state of Biafra coming up, which is formerly part of southern Nigeria.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Civil War? And I know it's a tremendously complicated topic, but if you could again give us maybe the quick and dirty version of it. How did
Yeah.
it start? Let's start with that. How did it begin?
Well, it starts with this idea, and it's a persistent one, that southeastern Nigeria, the South more generally, was the major sort of economic sort of engine of Nigeria, right? Given that the oil was coming from this particular region. And because the political structure had been federated, and also sort of informed by majority populations, the southeast was the least populated compared to the west and, of course, the north. And so, in many ways, there was no avenue to access power at the center. And so, folks in the Biafran region, which is southeastern Nigeria, um, made a bid to secede in order to reclaim access and more direct benefit from the crude oil economy that had been established there. And that was a no no. That was a no go for the federal government at the time. And so, that was the sort of spark for the Civil War. And of course, because there were a lot of enterprising Southerners in the North, and because the North largely controlled the government at the time in terms of the president, and it wasn't really the North, it was actually more the Middle Belt, Northern Middle Belt region, folks in the army that really took the reins of power and then didn't let go of those reins for quite a long time afterwards, really tried to maintain Nigeria as a whole. And so the southeastern Nigeria paid a very high price for that bid that they made, and they're still kind of working out the legacies of that the Civil War.
Speaking of which, so after the Civil War ended, how did the politics of Nigeria evolve? Like what happened next after the war ended?
It was very hard to um, govern the territory as a singular unit, and it was also very hard to um, redistribute resources in the way that the government had been set up in this kind of centralized way um, with a kind of federated distribution of resources. And so, the military was one avenue of authoritarian sort of control over these resources, and they very quickly nationalized the oil industry, which then kept a certain group of people in power. And as you can see, even in recent years of democracy, former military dictators have become presidents, sort of civilian presidents. And so, Fred Cooper, who is another brilliant historian, really talks about this concept of the gatekeeper state as a way of describing both the colonial state and how it was economically structured and politically structured, and how post colonial states are now sort of dealing with those legacies of political economy. The idea of a gatekeeper state is basically, you know, governments are trained to manage the flow of things and people across the gate. It's really about governing resources as opposed to governing people. And so they're not as much interested in the making the lives of their civilians or the civilian population sort of connected and integrated, but rather to maintain and continue the extraction of resources and the flow of those resources. And I would say that is the best description I can find for post colonial states, and in particular Nigeria. Another thing that I would point out is because Nigeria's economy is more than 80%, if not close to 90%, based on crude oil, it isn't a diversified economy. And so much of the resources that flow to the government and those in control of the government, the elites, comes from oil and the control of that resource. So you can imagine that sort of authoritarianism is the best way to monopolize the use of potential force in order to protect those assets, right? And so I think that that is one way of describing um, at least the terrain on which Nigerian politics sort of plays on in the post independence period.
Okay. So just to make sure I understand the idea behind the gatekeeper state, it's not about the people. I mean, the people are kind of a resource to be managed themselves almost, or at least a
Yeah.
thing to be kept passive as the resources keep flowing out and as the money keeps going and as
Mhm.
power is just able to be better cemented. Okay.
Yeah, when the state is not reliant on its population for tax revenue and is instead reliant on external or multinational corporations for rents, it is not accountable to civil society same way that our society is, for example, which is fairly diversified, right? And that does rely on a tax base, right?
Yeah. And so people have no means of really pushing back.
No,
All right.
and the government has no incentive to respond.
Sure. And that, I guess, explains. I mean, we don't have enough time to go all the way into some of the other things that evolve afterwards. But when you look at the
Mhm.
history of Nigeria after the Civil War, it seems like it's dictator, new coup. Oh, here's a republic for 3 or 4 years, and then oh, new dictator, and
Mhm.
that kind of flows out of the fact of a non-diversified economy. Okay, interesting.
Mhm.
So, speaking of which, last question, probably last question. Don't hold me to that, but probably last question. It seems as though the history of Nigeria has been plagued by imperialism and dictatorship and coups and strife. Does Boko Haram thrive in part because the people of Nigeria have maybe just seen so much violence that they've grown accustomed to it? Or maybe just to put it another way, does Nigeria's history of violence in any way, shape, or form contribute to its current plight, its current situation on the ground today?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a correlation between this history of violence and the violent history of Nigeria. Um, Boko Haram takes advantage of the fact that the government is not accountable to civil society. And I think you mentioned at the top of this episode that more Muslims are being terrorized by Boko Haram than Christians. And so it begs the question, why is the United States in the neighborhood, right? Or I think at least threatening to enter the neighborhood. Um, and there are some interesting shifts that are occurring both within with Nigeria specifically, but also Nigeria within the context of West Africa. The first is that Nigeria is has decided very recently to couple itself from the dollar and is open to doing and tying more of its currency to China. That's a big deal because China is becoming and has been becoming a big player in Africa. The other thing is that Nigeria has also pledged precious sort of resources, minerals, precious, those rare earth minerals to China and Russia. This is a direct threat to US interests, right? In this kind of race to get access to these rare earth minerals our technology sort of centered economy. The other thing is in the neighborhood, France has also been losing ground based on um, countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, kicking them out of their military bases, kicking their militaries out in terms of their presence. And so, what is happening is a shift away from the West towards a not very much better East. But with actors that are not as interested in controlling the local and sort of more immediate politics of these countries. And so I would venture to argue that it is not about Christianity or protecting Christians, but rather about protecting US interests, not just in Nigeria, but in the region. The other thing is, I'll stop here, is that Nigeria used to have to import refined oil from the United States because it had no refineries in the country, which is one of the legacies from the colonial period. It just built its own refinery, so it no longer relies on the United States for that resource, which is ironic because it produces oil, right? So how is it that in 2025, at the time when they are able to refine their own oil? So I think other factors to take into consideration when thinking about the geopolitics of where Nigeria sits in relation to the United States and our interests.
Wow, those are some fascinating hot takes there at the end. That's really, really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing
Of
all
course.
that, and thank you for your time and thank you for your knowledge.
Of course. I'm happy to participate. This was great.